Bum bum
Dun,
bum.
dun,
Bum bum bum.
dun, dun, dun.
Wait, no, guys.
Bum, bum.
I have music.
Oh, it's hold music. Actually, that's not bad. We should just remix that and have that be our intro. Like,
So, fair warning for all the listeners, I am currently on holds with the California Unemployment Department for the 7th hour. So, you're going to get some nice background music whenever you hear me speaking on this episode. A little flavor of state government in action.
Welcome to Left Field, where four friends discuss their fantasy Congress leagues from a leftist perspective, and we figure out what the Democrats have been up to. My name is Chandana Nabale.
I'm Alexi Jenkins.
I'm Luis Pagan.
and I'm Himanshu Pandey.
That's them, FBI. Sicko.
How are we doing on fantasy league? Who's leading?
Marksy Marks. First place. Still. Wait, you're actually second to last. You're 8 of 9.
I'm Lexi from last season.
So, I'm Chandan from last season. I'm successful now because I sold out. I sold out and now I'm successful.
Right, your team is running on white male privilege.
And it's working.
That's what it'll get you. Yeah.
I will say the squad has been more active than usual.
Squad update.
I saw Rashida Tlaib was yelling at Biden earlier today.
Oh yeah, they're all yelling at him.
We would like to establish that this is a pro-Palestine podcast. Fuck the state of Israel. Give it back.
Are we on Give It Back? Is that where we're at?
We're on Give It Back. Land back, damn it.
I mean, yeah, it's an active colonial situation, actively violent genocide. So, yep.
Having massive human rights violations. The whole Palestinians can't go back to their own land.
Full blown racial apartheid.
Dude, they blew up a Associated Press and Al Jazeera news building.
Didn't you hear? There was a Hamas official there, so they can do whatever the hell they want.
Right, what is that? It's like, how is that defense?
It's such a US move to just commit war crimes and then put out a bullshit excuse. It's so from our playbook, it's like not even funny.
They grew up so fast.
Right?
There's ants in your house, so I bombed it. Sorry, yeah, I couldn't do anything else. I had to bomb it.
Over 50% of the population of Gaza is under the age of 18. If you kill one person, it's a coin flip of did you just kill a child or did you kill an adult?
Oh, and they are flipping that coin.
Oh, yeah.
That coin has been flipped many times within the past week or so.
Always child, always child.
It's actually a weighted coin. Also, Joe Biden said, hey, maybe we should have calm in the Middle East. And Israel was like, fuck you, Gaza, and shot another rocket immediately after.
I'm sure Israel's like, what does that even mean, bro?
Oh, they know what it means. They know what it means. Like the Palestinians are violent, so they exterminate them. They put some new settlements, and now there's peace.
I mean, they also know that what Biden says has no weight of force until he starts pulling the funding. He can say whatever he wants, but until
Yeah, it
the
doesn't fucking
military
matter.
aid gets cut off, it doesn't mean anything.
Didn't we just sign another arms deal the
Yeah,
other
another
day?
$700 million.
Yeah. And if you're telling your kid, oh, I really disapprove of what you're doing, but at the same time, you're slipping them like $1,000 cash, what message are they going to get?
I mean, he literally doesn't disapprove, though, right? There's never been hey, Israel, you got to stop kind of thing. It's more like, shit, I gotta appease the American people. What do I say?
Yeah.
Right. This is fine for me. So what do I say? While still maintaining some level of U.S. hegemony around all of it.
Absolutely.
Something pretty interesting is why is this happening recently? And it's because Netanyahu has failed to form a government 3 times now. They've got him on numerous charges, and he's appeasing all of the crazy right-wing people to stay in power. Just the Trump playbook.
He is very, very far right. It's also just really interesting how much the political discourse has moved in favor of Palestine recently, because Luis and I were talking the other day about how years and years ago when we were first learning about these issues, we were both kind of like, okay, but the Palestinians are really getting massively fucked over here. But you literally couldn't even say that out loud. It was not at all politically acceptable to say that because of the tight ties between the American government and the Israeli government. And now, finally, for the first time, you can say free Palestine and you're not immediately called an anti-Semite because people are conflating the Jewish people and the Israeli state, which are two completely different things.
Somehow we've made it all the way to free Palestine. I don't know what's going on, what's in the water, but
all those Instagram activist accounts waking up
Honestly,
with people. It's very confusing because it really is. And like the world is the same as it's ever been, but people are reacting so differently in 2020, 2021. I guess because they followed a couple of like woke Instagram accounts now, or I guess are bored in quarantine. Like it's very confusing because human rights abuses were occurring long before that. Like this is not the first time that anything like this has happened between Israel and Palestine, but it just aligns with like being politically aware, being a more mainstream thing. It's a very weird dynamic.
Yeah, I think people just didn't care back then either, right? It was just like, this doesn't affect me in any way, and I only get my news from the news. And then now people get their news from everywhere, like disseminates through social media a little bit faster now. But yeah, people also like read articles now, which is amazing, right? Like they're like, hey, like this shit is fucked up. And then they just like highlight, the 240 characters on Twitter. And then like you're scrolling through like, wait, what the fuck was that? And then you read it, and then all of a sudden you're informed, right? And then you retweet and maybe two other people are informed. It spreads a lot quicker than like, you read a headline, you scroll, and then you don't really read the article, right? So you get your like bland, like, 200 dead in Israel-Hamas fight, right? And it's like, well, 232 Palestinians died and 13 Israeli died. You wouldn't know that until you actually read the article, right?
I don't know if you guys saw this, but like at, I believe either the Wailing Wall or like close to the Dome of the Rock, there was like some shit on fire, like in Jerusalem.
Oh, it was a mosque. It was the mosque in that area.
It's like the third most sacred site in all of Islam.
There was a bunch of Hasidic Jewish people like literally raving, like jumping up and down and like chanting like wipe them off the face of the earth, or like basically like wipe them out of history. Like
that video is extremely disturbing.
At this point, if we can't realize that religion is like literally just fucking killing us, I don't understand. I don't know why anyone values this shit.
And also, ethnostates are bad. Ethnostates have been bad. Ethnostates continue to be bad. It does not matter which group is doing the ethnostate. It's equally genocide-y, even if they were previously genocided. That does not give you a pass to make an ethnostate. Never do an ethnostate.
How should we be organizing our land?
First, we shouldn't take land from an already established country and say, by the way, this belongs to this group now. You know how you guys hate each other? Sorry about that. Have fun.
That question goes back to a very specific moment in history. And I think people don't realize how much our modern borders are a direct consequence of post-World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, when these European nations essentially had to turn their attention back to their completely shattered nations and could no longer control an empire in the same very heavy-handed, actively colonial way that they had been since the 1800s, in some cases, since the 1500s in other cases. So what happened essentially with the founding of international organizations is these European powers took the portions of the world that they had and just carved them up however they saw fit. Happened in Asia, happened in Africa, happened in the Middle East, essentially the entire Eastern Hemisphere and some of the Western Hemisphere, where a bunch of European nations just arbitrarily decided what the nation of Angola, the nation of Ethiopia, the nation of Saudi Arabia, Iran would look like based on almost nothing. Certainly not the ethnic groups that existed, the traditional people groups, like the ethnic rivalries that existed. Because of that, we essentially divided up our nation states in the worst way possible.
Well, purposefully. The way that the Middle East was cut up was specifically done to divide ethnic and religious groups so that there could never be harmony within the Middle East. And I mean, this is the exact same shit that happened in India and Pakistan. Like that border should not have been drawn where it was. It is just an arbitrary line. There are no physical features that would demarcate like one land versus another land. They cut it based on what religious lines, and even then it wasn't actually done that well.
No, they literally like drew that shit on a map and were like, cool, that. Lexi, do you think we should have borders?
Ideally, no. I think we should at least have way more porous borders in the meantime. What I think should happen at this point is we need to form a real global government, not the UN, because basically what the UN is are all the Western nations bossing around all of the other nations because of relative power and economic influence from the mid 1900s carrying over to the present day and keeping there from being democratic representation for the rest of the world. And essentially, the US is responsible for the largest portion of the UN's funding, which
Your call will be answered if the order was received.
The US never pays. The UN's chronically underfunded. The US, China, everyone in the Security Council, Russia, England, and France can basically veto anything that they want vetoed from the UN. Other regions of the world don't even have close to democratic representation, and this hits the global South particularly hard. Essentially, what that means is that like the field of international law and international aid work is still extremely colonial. It's extremely white savior because nations in the global South, poorer nations, browner nations, essentially don't get a say at all in what happens. And it's just these big nations with a lot of economic power that tell everybody else what's going to happen and really exploit the other nations for economic gain, for political gain, for global power. Essentially, it's colonialism, but put in a softer, nicer form. What we should do is dismantle that system and create a truly democratic, truly fair world government with representation proportional to population. The US is never going to agree to that because China and India would have a ton of power, and the US would go from the top spot to probably like number 5. And other nations would be able to come together and form coalitions that would have a lot of power. So like African nations, Middle Eastern nations, Asian nations could be very, very powerful if they united. But it would actually be fair. And then once we had that, we could go through a process of redesigning nation states in a way that has input from everyone, in a way that takes account of the political loyalties, the ethnic loyalties, the religious loyalties of all those groups, and reduce conflict and come to compromises because everyone's coming to the table at the same time. That would be extremely fraught, but I think we have to have as big a scale process as we had to get into this mess to get out of this mess.
I feel like a lot of people on the right, there's a lot of fear around this concept of a one world government. That's what they call it. I'm sure you being from like the conservative Californian area have potentially heard this.
Which sounds fake, but it's a thing.
What do you feel like they're talking about and what do you feel like they're concerned about?
They're scared of, they're racist. Like, honestly, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
I can say, I obviously can't speak for every region of the world, but I can, wait.
This is Ryan speaking, and get your social security numbers.
Oh my God.
Get your money, girl.
This is unheard of, y'all. To get through the unemployment line. Wow.
Okay. So this is Representative Yay or Nay, the segment where we profile a Democratic member of Congress and then give them a yay or a nay based on whether we think they're actually in government fighting for the people. So today I wanted to talk about Catherine Cortez Masto. She is a senator from Nevada. She was actually my first pick this season, and I knew nothing about her, absolutely nothing about her. I picked her because she was the highest point getting senator that I knew absolutely nothing about. So I was really excited to profile her. So like I said, she is the senator from Nevada. She's now the senior senator, but she was only elected in 2016, so fairly new to the Senate. She replaced Harry Reid. So she's been described as Harry Reid's protege, and she's really good family friends with Harry Reid. Harry Reid used to be majority leader in the House a while back. I think one of the most recent reasons his name has come up is because he is really important in politics in Nevada. So the Nevada Democratic Party is essentially called the Reid machine because that's how tremendously influential he is. So this came up recently because the Democratic Party in Nevada had a Democratic election in which they replaced their top leadership of establishment Democrats with Democratic Socialists. And then all the members of the Reid machine, the establishment, quit and siphoned off all the money from the Democratic Party, completely bankrupting the party and screwing over the democratically elected Democratic Socialists. So Nevada's Democratic Party has blown up recently, and that will become relevant later. So just some context. Reid also has some very, very problematic stances from the past I think is important to mention because her political identity is still so closely tied with Harry Reid. He was anti same-sex marriage and against abortion. He strongly supported the use of the death penalty, including a vote in favor of executing people based on crimes they committed as minors, which the Supreme Court has said is a no-no. He has also voted against banning semi-automatic weapons or holding gun manufacturers or dealers liable in court for mass shootings. So the NRA actually wrote a letter praising Harry Reid in 2009. So that is Catherine Cortez Mastos's mentor, basically her like person that kind of got her this position. So a little background on her. She got her bachelor's in finance from the University of Nevada, Reno, and she is a lawyer. So she got her law degree from Gonzaga University. She worked for 4 years as a civil attorney, then 2 years as a criminal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Then she did 2 terms as Nevada's Attorney General. She said during this time, she worked closely with law enforcement to keep Nevada's communities safe. Like I said earlier, she was elected to the Senate in 2016. She's actually the first Latina in the Senate at all and the first woman to represent Nevada. And she's running for re-election in 2022. So her prominent legislation, one of her really, really big priorities are the cops. She loves the cops. She talks about the cops a lot and how much she loves them. So one of her big bills that she's been touting recently is called Confidentiality Opportunities for Peer Support, or COPS Counseling Act. So this is co-sponsored with Republican POS Chuck Grassley. And the bill is to provide confidential peer counseling to the police. And I just wanted to point out, since a lot of us are in Georgia, that John Ossoff is also signed on to this bill.
Oh, good.
She, a little while back, introduced prominent legislation to provide stimulus money to the U.S. travel industry. Policies on Medicare for all, she is a firm no. So she said it was quote unquote admirable, but not immediately plausible. So she supports improving the Affordable Care Act instead because she sees it as more feasible. Green New Deal, she has been very silent on the Green New Deal. She's one of those like Warnock who kind of like talks around it a lot. She's not terrible on the environment. She supports increased investments in renewable energy technology, government limitations on greenhouse gas emissions, the growth of green jobs, so essentially the Green New Deal, and increasing clean energy used from sources like solar. Essentially, she follows Harry Reid's approach when it comes to the environment, which focuses on bringing local stakeholders together, including Republicans, but also including like indigenous groups, which is something that he did locally in Nevada, which is a positive thing. So really focusing on like compromise and negotiation and finding local opportunities for action rather than federal opportunities. So some have called this a quote unquote lowercase Green New Deal approach, emphasizing pragmatism and commitment to local issues. A noteworthy thing she's done for the environment is oppose the building of a national nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain. Reparations, she's got nothing on that. Indigenous rights. So she co-sponsored the Not Invisible Act with Rep. Deb Haaland to create an advisory committee within the Bureau of Indian Affairs about how best to report and respond to violence and human trafficking across Indigenous communities, which is a very big issue. She is very into sex trafficking. That's an issue that she's like worked a lot on in the past and continues to work on. LGBTQ plus rights. This is where it gets bad. When she was Nevada's Attorney General, she defended Nevada's ban on same-sex marriage in a lawsuit challenging the ban in 2012. She wrote that the ban on gay marriage was the will of the people. And in her brief, she compared the state banning gay marriage to the state banning bigamy and incest, which is pretty horrible. Now, though, she says she supports it. So we got that. Women's rights, she is supported by Planned Parenthood and Emily's List, and she supports abortion rights. So she's good on women's rights. Police reform, no surprise. She loves the police. She's explicitly said, I don't support defunding the police. I support reforming them to address systemic racism. She's very pro-cop, and she said in interviews that she has always been an advocate for community policing instead of like defunding, which if you've studied policing at all, it's the same system of militaristic dominance. So community policing, while it sounds great and while it sounds like it would fix the problems, it doesn't. The problems are a lot deeper than just like making the police actually talk to Black people. It's like structurally racist. So you need to do more than that. She's also recently talked about funding behavioral health services to respond to substance abuse and mental health problems. So she actually kind of does support defund the police if she was honest about what they're asking for, because that's essentially what defund the police is. Hilariously, she this past week got me points because she sponsored a resolution that got passed that designated May 9th through the 15th as National Police Week.
What?
She has a very spotty record on drug reform. So she has basically like been very hesitant on recreational marijuana. In 2016, she said she was pro medical marijuana, but thinks that we need more regulatory infrastructure to have recreational marijuana be legal. She actually voted privately as a citizen against legalization when it was on the ballot in Nevada in 2000, which like was 20 years ago. But she also said, I do not see the benefit in our state in legalizing marijuana. In 2018, though, she did co-sponsor the States Act, which would exempt individuals who are in compliance with state law from federal enforcement. And then immigration, she's one of those Democrats who has some good things, but is still really about like the right immigrants. So she wants to create a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people in our country now, which is great and absolutely needs to happen. But she also thinks it's important to quote unquote secure our borders and crack down on fraud. So that raises a lot of red flags for me because it basically draws a distinction between which are the good immigrants and which are the bad immigrants. Like, are you a good immigrant who's already in the US, or are you a bad, undesirable immigrant who we don't want coming in? You know, in 2019, she co-sponsored a bill that would mandate that ICE agents get approval from a supervisor before engaging in enforcement actions at sensitive locations, except in special circumstances. So while it's good that you need your boss to sign off if you're going to go arrest somebody at the courthouse, why aren't we taking away that power from ICE at all? You know, it's one of those things where it seems like I'm glad it's happening, but it's such a half measure and a lot of abuses are still going to occur. Anyway, footnotes. She says she supports capitalism. She's like all in on capitalism. A good thing she did recently, though, was she was one of the senators who helped persuade Joe Manchin to vote in favor of the unemployment increase back in March. So she worked on that behind closed doors, and that was a good outcome. Scandals. This one's kind of convoluted. Essentially, she was prosecuting Nevada's lieutenant government for mishandling public funds. And a couple of days before the prosecution was set to start, her husband was set to throw a fundraiser for somebody else running for that seat. So it looked very politically corrupt and was seen as this like big setback for her. And ultimately the charges ended up getting dismissed, but people were like accusing her of prosecutorial misconduct. The really fun one is going back to the shit show that is the Nevada Democratic Party and the lack of unity there now. Basically, when the establishment Democrats were leaving office, they took $450,000 out of the party treasury and moved it so they could control it, even though they didn't have control of the party anymore. They left the incoming Democratic Socialists who are going to be running the party with less than $100,000 on hand. And a former staffer said, oh, they're not starting from zero. There are funds in there to continue to pay rent and to keep the party going. So they literally bankrupted them and left them with like the bare minimum. And all of that money, the $450,000 they moved to use for their own reasons, they're using that for Cortez Mastos' re-election campaign.
Oh, holy fuck.
So she has pushed candidates in that race to oppose the rise of the leftist bloc in the party in Nevada. So she's very anti the swell of Democratic Socialist enthusiasm in that region of the country. And I think that that'll have really interesting implications for the 2022 race, because now they don't have money, but the Democratic Socialists are the Democratic Party now. And the Reid machine might try to set up their own proxy party, but the Democratic Party institutionally now is Democratic Socialists. So they could very well try to challenge her in 2022. They have a lot of good reasons to be pissed at the establishment. So I found that part fascinating. What do you guys think?
Boo.
Yeah, definitely a nay. Wow. I was gonna ask for more information, but after all the shit I've just heard,
You could have stopped talking probably like 10 minutes ago.
but I was willing to like understand more about what her position is regarding, like, of course, just loving cops so much, you know, and the community police thing. I'm like, okay, what are you trying to go for here? Is it just like you are purely in favor of police? Okay, I can't agree with that.
She just loves leather daddies.
Oh my God. The vibes I really get from her are that she is an opportunist. Her political stances have changed a lot over the past 10 years since she was first elected as Attorney General, because the tide of the Democratic Party has changed a lot in that intervening time. So she has purportedly moved farther left on a lot of these issues, and she is saying some of the right things, but I don't see a lot of tangible action on the things that she has been saying. One of the other reasons I think she's a political opportunist is because she's very skittish to go all the way and say, oh, the name of the thing that I support is the Green New Deal. She'll say, I support green jobs, I support investing in renewable energy, but she won't say the thing that she thinks is too far left. Everything's controlled by Democrats right now in Nevada. So it's a very conservative move of her to do things like that. But coming from under the wing of somebody like Harry Reid, who's obviously a really big political strategist, it makes sense that she would operate this way. I just don't like it. I'm gonna nay her.
She actually gives me a lot of Kamala Harris vibes. Just the like Attorney General bit, the past marijuana stance bit, and like moving on that.
Are you going to be against recreational marijuana when it works in your own state?
Yeah, Kamala Harris recently called a coalition of her and the 8 senators of color to talk about things. And I don't even remember specifically what it was, because it was like a meaningless summit. But it really struck me that, wow, there are only 8 senators of color, and it's Cory Booker, Alex Padilla, who we've talked about at length on this podcast, and how much he sucks and is an opportunist, and Catherine Cortez Mastos, and obviously like 5 others like Mazie Hirono, who is better and we need to do a profile on. But it's just disheartening that the representation that we have, it's the people who played the game, and it's not people who are representing like the people or out there really fighting for the interests of their community. It's people who are there because they were a prosecutor and they did things that were not in the interest of racial justice. So it's just sad.
It's insane that she's so pro-border here when, 1, Nevada's not even on the border of Mexico, and 2, it has a very high assimilated like Latino population. I mean, they are major contributors to the workforce there. And to be a Latino yourself and to be just blocking others from coming in and getting the opportunities that you have, man, that right there is upper middle class immigrant like mentality at its finest. They're going to come steal all of our opportunities. They're going to come. That's just how good Latino representation is there.
I'm excited for Nevada to run someone against her. It's 100% going to happen now. And I'm also excited to see what that Democratic Party is going to do.
I'm really excited about that. That gives me a lot of hope, because they did it, They
fucking did it. I mean, that's the model for the country.
I was thinking about something with regards to Yucca Mountain. I remember reading some articles about how the Democratic Party over in Nevada kind of capitulated to Trump's demands once he started to be against the Yucca Mountain project, which to give a little bit of background, the original idea was that because Nevada is so isolated from the rest of the United States, and by that I mean it's kind of towards the center, it's very stable geologically. They wanted to create a giant vault essentially for all of our nuclear waste that we've produced so far, which isn't actually that much, but it needs to be somewhere stable.
Yeah.
For the rest of its half-life to run out.
Yeah, this time we don't want to store it on an island like we did in the Marshall Islands, and it's continually leaking and completely destroying their way of life.
Yeah, so they had that plan, but obviously Nevada was super against it. By the way, I'm pretty sure that the federal government owns like 70% of the land in Nevada. It has the least amount of state-owned land.
The land's basically unfarmable, so that's why.
Yeah, and that's why it was kind of like what was considered to be a perfect place for it, geologically stable.
I mean, it's still a valuable ecosystem. Just because it isn't economically super valuable, just because it can't produce capital for us, doesn't mean that it's not something that should be preserved.
Well, I'm not saying it shouldn't be preserved. I'm saying actually it'd probably be more preserved if it had some. I mean, just look at what happens to Chernobyl. All of that land is like a perfect national park.
All the deers just have like 3 heads.
There's one, and they have mild mutations. What I'm saying is humans won't be in that area anyway, and it's better than, like you said, sticking it on an island where it's accessible to the ocean.
It's got to go somewhere. Let's just say that. So I will say Yucca Mountain, in comparison to the other geological areas where you could put that waste, probably honestly is one of the best places to put it.
Your girl Catherine is very opposed to it, and she's gonna kill the plan. So
Boo, Catherine.
just another Democratic rep who actually sucks so much.
But I agree with you that like human movement should be free and flowing, like as it always has fucking been.
It makes no sense to trap people in the plot of land and under the completely arbitrary government that they happen to be born in. It makes no sense from the perspective of human wellness, shared values, distribution of resources.
Borders are basically just nationalist traps for us to fight with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And to form nations to go to war and to create a lot of profit for multinational corporations. The nation state is kind of at this point just a tool that corporations use to pit against each other to get lower tax rates, cheaper labor, cheaper everything, production costs all at the same time from different countries, and keep everyone fighting and keep everyone racing to the bottom, and you'll make a lot more money.
Do we have any international workers unions?
I mean, not seriously, because the labor conditions are intentionally so different across countries in different stages of development that it's really, really hard to unite workers. And also because of nationalism and religion, people aren't really interested in class solidarity. They're more interested in racial solidarity or nationalist solidarity or religious solidarity, which is a big shame because the world would be a lot better place if there was more class solidarity from not rich people, because rich people have a lot of class solidarity. They're very united. Luis, hit us with a bill.
This week, the Senate passed S-1260, which is known as the Endless Frontier Act, to establish a new directorate for tech and innovation in the NSF, and to establish regional technology hub program, and to require a strategy and report on economic security, science, research, innovation, manufacturing, and job creation, and to establish a critical supply chain resiliency program. And this is all a response to the Chinese government.
Luis, what is the NSF?
The National Science Foundation. They drive a lot of the grant programs for science, technology, and innovation. And this is the first time I believe that they're establishing a directorate.
Can we just be generally doing this? What does China have to do with this?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we should be generally doing this, but the US has underfunded science and research and development generally for generations. Honestly, I think Reagan was probably the really, really big cuts to those types of programs. We were investing heavily during the 60s, especially during the space race under Kennedy. And then after that, with the growing Republican ethos of austerity and trimming away as much quote unquote government fat as possible, the things that got trimmed away were our advancements in science and technology. Those things are not seen as inherently valuable, would be my answer to why we're doing it in relationship to China. We're not doing it out of curiosity or out of wanting to make the world or humanity a better or more advanced place. We're doing it because we see our power as the global superpower slipping and China assuming that role, which China has made no secret of the fact that they're doing that. They've been investing heavily in Pan-Asian infrastructure and in African infrastructure, basically weaving out a web of connections in a much more subtle way than the US did, because we mainly did it through military might and overthrowing governments. China has been doing more like infrastructure programs and doing it through diplomacy, issuing loans, like all the funding for the US government, essentially. So China is in a very, very politically, economically, geopolitically powerful situation right now. And that scares all the politicians in the US, because America being number one is so fundamental to America's identity. And I think people from that generation really can't imagine a world in which America is not number one, because it lessens their power as our governing politicians. It lessens the bank accounts of the rich people in this country. Basically, we're investing in it now because we want to be number one. We want to start a new space race against China, essentially. I honestly see this as the beginning of a new Cold War era for the US, because both nations, us and China, have been investing heavily throughout the world. And we're never going to have a direct war with China with boots on the ground in mainland China or in mainland US, we're going to have proxy wars, and we're going to have fights over technology like we did with Russia and who can get to the moon. We're going to have fights over armed races. China made opening moves a long, long time ago. And this is the US finally refocusing on the geopolitical sphere and making its opening move to China, which I don't think is a good thing. I think the Chinese government is very scary and does do a lot of horrible things, but we need to stop relying on being the bully of the world. And we need to start relying on empowering the rest of the world to form an alliance that can adequately check countries that are too rich, too big, too powerful for the good of humanity, essentially. And that's not the US's job. And it shouldn't be the US's job. It should be the world's job to say this is not okay.
Yeah, I think the US in particular is realizing how much it depends on China, and is probably adopting what is a very Chinese policy, which is to become self-sufficient. That's something that China's been working on for years and years. Just a direct quote from Schumer: "We can either have a world where the Chinese Communist Party determines the rules of the road for 5G, AI, and quantum computing, or we can make sure that the United States gets there first." Basically, we've been, or at least a lot of politicians have considered us to be the trendsetters, and we've completely lost that. I mean, just look at the fact that China basically dropped a rocket out of the sky because they didn't put in backup systems to prevent it from happening. And there's no international space law against that. So luckily it landed in the ocean. But if that should have landed in New York, thousands, tens of thousands of people could have just died without a nation to be there to establish those rules, or without what would hopefully be a global council doing that. China's going to step up and take that place.
Yeah, they're also buying a ton of gold.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're basically trying to have everyone owe them everything. And, one day they will come to collect.
China could destabilize the entire nation of the US at any moment that they choose because we owe them so much money. If they called in our debt, we absolutely could not pay it. It's astronomical. And we would have two options: either cede everything to China and fall rapidly and have our economy destroyed, or go to war. So the reason China doesn't do that is because they don't want to get bombed or invaded by the US, but they could absolutely make that calculation and go hawkish at any moment and completely destroy our country.
And this is a hawkish response. I mean, this is this is the US trying to assert itself. $100 billion to invest in basic and advanced research and commercialization of the research. So great, we get to make a whole bunch of millionaires even richer. And education and training programs in key technologies like AI. Also, like $52 billion to semiconductors. So there aren't very many semiconductor producers outside of Asia. So it seems like the US is trying to get back into that.
As the resident non-scientist, what is a semiconductor? I'm going to ask this question. I have a Bachelor of Arts, and I'm going to ask what a semiconductor is.
Let's just say that without us having this manufacturing capabilities, all computer parts, everything are coming out of Asia, and we don't have the capability to make them ourselves.
There's also a semiconductor shortage right now, which is a whole nother thing.
And we're not first on the list, so we need to find a way to do that.
Trying to bring manufacturing in-house, right? Like that's like the end vision, right? It's like, hey, what if America did what we did in like the 50s and 60s and we did everything in-house?
Which is hilarious, because the only reason that our manufacturing sector was hollowed out is because of globalization, and because the wealthy said, hey, we can produce this way cheaper over there in that poor country, in China and Vietnam, in Malaysia, and pay not even starvation wages, below starvation wages, nothing for parts, and then sell it back to Americans for the same price without cutting costs at all.
The consequence of that is going to be like the price of goods increasing, I would imagine. I don't know anything about economics in that regard, but I would imagine if we're doing everything in-house, we're not going to be able to do that cheaply unless the government subsidizes it, which, we'll take some more loans from China to do that. Oh.
But they're going to raise prices on consumers regardless of whether their costs increase or not. I think you're absolutely right in saying their costs will increase, but even if they don't, prices are going to go up.
Yeah, but it does come down to supply and demand at the end of the day, right? So there will be like a fine line that they'll try to strike of like, okay, like we can raise our prices, but not by so much that we're like priced out. So
they can just put tariffs on foreign goods to make them even more expensive. So I don't know. I think if companies have a good justification, a good story for why their prices are going up, they're going to raise them without a second thought, as long as the consumers aren't going to be like revolting in the street or buying it cheaper somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, if you've noticed, the price of your phone is slowly approaching the price of a car. Like it's getting there. You see, it's like as expensive as a laptop now, which makes sense. It is like a tiny laptop in your hand, and people are like, that's fine. We're still gonna buy the latest one because you can.
Yeah, now you don't just have a car payment, you also have a phone payment that you have to deal with. And a lot of the service providers are just kind of wrapping them all into one big payment. And, it's easier for the consumer to digest.
It's kind of interesting how like almost like all scientific progress is done in the name of competing with another foreign power.
Yep, that's what happens when you orient your society around profit and sheer muscle. It makes absolutely no sense.
Our government is purposefully adversarial, right? I mean, and if you think about it, the way the U.S. was formed, at least from the white colonial perspective, the U.S. had to assert itself as a power similar to France and Britain and Spain. And so what does that mean? That means having colonies. That means extracting resources from somewhere else. And we're just perpetuating that, That was the template long ago. It worked. And I think the Republicans saw that and hopped onto it after the 50s.
While we're on the topic of perpetual expansion, I do want to call out the name of the bill, which you mentioned earlier, but I think deserves a special mention.
The Endless Frontier Act.
Yeah,
literally a direct reference to genocide of Native Americans and American empire.
Is that like Manifest Destiny and just a new way of saying it?
You've always got a place to colonize. Always got to have a frontier.
Also, like I was saying earlier, a tie-in to the Cold War, because at that time, space was the final frontier. Now, I guess it's Asia.
So it's not just manufacturing tech. There's also a subtitle of the act, which is Space Preservation and Conjunction Emergency Act of 2021. So the Space Act. So there's a lot of investment into that as well. Again, I'm pretty sure that a lot of this really passed in the first place because of that rocket coming down and there being no global legislation around it.
So China officially has a rover on Mars.
Oh, they had one since 2018. It's been a while. They've had one on there. Yeah, they sent a rover up there quite some time ago to take pictures.
Is it like active, like doing shit?
Well, I think they have a new rover on there, which is probably what you're referring to.
Yeah.
South Korea also just launched a very, very big space program that's going to span, I think, 30 years and is very ambitious. So although the bill doesn't directly reference South Korea and their space program, I'm sure that was kind of a kick in the pants to American politicians to say, wait, space is our game. That's the one thing we can kind of hold over the rest of the world and say, we did this first. We're the innovators when it comes to space.
Yeah, and there's specifically science missions to Mars as a allocation for the funding. So that's all in there. One other thing that I thought was pretty interesting is that I'm seeing if it's still on here, but the original legislation included sanctions against China for the genocide happening in Xinjiang, so the Uyghur genocide. Don't see it on here anymore, but it was on previously. And there's another bill that was kind of introduced beforehand, but in parallel to this current bill, which was the Strategic Competition Act of 2021. That was going to give some $450 billion to Pan-Asian countries, so just across the Asian region.
Can we like have healthcare though?
Can we forgive student loans?
Nah, who cares about them?
It's just like, oh yeah, we'll like make America more competitive by like funding all this science shit, but like basic healthcare, I don't think that'll have an impact on our productivity or competitiveness in the world. Like, nah.
It's always like a cost-based thing, right? They always think about it from like the perspective of like, what are the immediate short-term returns of this? And the short-term in this is like, okay, next 2 years, right? Like
it's the capitalist way of doing it.
Yeah, the Medicare for all returns are like 5 to 10 years. It's like a healthier society. We don't need health. We can make money elsewhere.
It's also a direct resumption of the neoliberal globalist agenda that left off at the end of the Obama era. So Obama had been working on negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, which is essentially, I think the easiest way to understand it is NAFTA, but with the US and Southeast Asia to counter China's growing influence and to strengthen our ties in the region, get that cheap slave labor. There were also some really, really horrible provisions that I looked into that would ban lawsuits against companies for international human rights abuses under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you just have to look at NAFTA and how much it really fucked over the little guy in every country, Canada, Mexico, the US. Mexico's base of local food production was basically single-handedly decimated by NAFTA and the importation of cheap, sugary goods from the US. And then US workers really lost out by manufacturing and agriculture shifting to Mexico because of cheaper prices. So it's really a lose-lose situation. But this is just the Democrats going back to business as usual, to the predominant view at the end of the Obama administration that if we keep expanding forever, if we keep making the world a smaller, more homogenous place, everyone's going to get richer. And that's a desirable thing, which after everything we've been through, after all we've learned about the environment, all we've learned about human rights abuses, all we've learned about the way that workers are disadvantaged when you do these globalized trade deals, it just seems like an insane theory for how we should approach the world. But here we have the Biden administration and the Democrats pretending like nothing happened, pretending like the world hasn't changed and like this is still a good idea.
America's a Ponzi scheme. Constant growth. That's how we pay off all of our ever accumulating debts.
Mm-hmm.
You cut up a new swath of land, you sell it to the rich. They don't pay any taxes, but that initial payment, that pays off the debt for a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of write laws around that not collapsing, which is ridiculous. With 2008, we learned that if we need to go to Congress to get approved for a bailout package, that's a problem. That's what we really learned. And so now there's just direct injections into banks without, congressional approval. And that's what keeps our economy afloat and the dilution of the dollar. But, it's protected by American superpower, right? Our military superpower and the oil interests that we have.
It all comes back because we're spending money that we don't have and we're spending China's money that they're loaning us, which is increasing China's power. And then the politicians realize what they have done. And instead of not doing it anymore, they do bills like this.
Okay, so they put forth these set of bipartisan bills. I think it was originally called the China bill, and then it got broken out into all of these separate bills. But in that one I'd mentioned earlier, the Strategic Competition Act, $300 million allocated for the Countering Chinese Influence Fund to push back against the CCP specifically. I was just wanted to go back to that number, $655 million for funding for foreign militaries in the Indo-Pacific region and $450 million for the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative to ensure that the US and its partners can operate freely in the region. What this basically means is we're trying to make it so that we can go through the South China Sea.
Yeah, proxy war in the South China Sea.
Exactly. So if you see Japan and Vietnam, any of these obviously cited conflicts, you know why. It's so that we can sell a couple Raytheon missiles to pay for the next round of debt.
To Israel, to bomb Palestinian kids. It all is connected.
Yeah, $750 million we just made a sale.
That pays for the funding in the Indo-Pacific region.
You said $100 billion?
So $100 billion, that's for the tech stuff. This is the Endless Frontier Act.
It's just so facepalm. I agree with you, Lexi.
So it hurts
Every single
me.
time I hear it.
It just touts everything that America has done to completely destroy the world. They're so proud of it. And oh man, it hurts. It hurts.
That's American hegemony. We're always number one. War is peace.